Now, welcome to the last First Thought talk of this first weekend of First Thought talks. How did I manage to say all that without stumbling over my words? I'm not as bad as I think I am. What is the condition of the Western left these days? Has its emphasis changed away from universal ideas of justice and solidarity to concentration on identity and tribal concerns? Susan Neiman is going to tell us. She's caused a certain amount of consternation with her book, Woke is Not Left. The ruffling of self-righteous feathers is always enjoyable to observe, and she has done so comprehensively. She's an American moral philosopher, cultural commentator and essayist, and is currently living in Germany, where she's director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. She'll be interviewed by Fintan O'Toole, our most eminent journalist and author of the wonderful We Do Not Know Ourselves, a trip through his own life and Ireland's history in the second half of the 20th century and the start of the 21st. Things Fintan does is to review for the New York Review of Books. In that capacity, he reviewed Woke is Not Left, and as a result advised me to invite Susan to Galway. Not the first or the last of very useful pieces of advice that Fintan gives me about these talks. Here they both are. Please welcome Susan Neiman and Fintan O'Toole.
Good afternoon, friends. What a joy to be here again under Katrina's ever wonderful tutelage. And a particular pleasure to be with Susan, whose book, if you haven't read it, I would very strongly recommend. A really bracing and invigorating piece of work that is also tremendously accessible. I mean, it's a book that most of us who are not professional philosophers can read, which isn't always true of what philosophers do. Funny enough, I was thinking the most distinguished living Irish philosopher is a Galway man, Philip Pettit. Philip's from Ballygar, but I remember he was telling me, you may also remember there was the great tightrope walker was called Philippe Petit. Do you remember him? The guy who famously walked the Twin Towers, you know, that extraordinary thing he did. But Philip was telling me he was teaching in Princeton, and one morning he went in for his office hours, and one of his young undergraduates was sitting outside his office waiting for him to come in, and she was in floods of tears. And he said to her, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" You know, and she said, "Professor Pettit, you have to stop doing that stuff. You'll kill yourself." You know? It was an unusual image to confuse the philosopher with the tightrope walker, but actually, in a way, not entirely inapt. You know, because in a way, I think many of us feel in the current circumstances that we're trying to keep walking on a very, very thin rope of reason, you know, with a long way to fall, and no safety net and increasing headwinds, you know, and we do need we need philosophy. We need the kind of systematic thinking to you know, help us to keep our balance, I think, in this period, and Susan is certainly one of the people who does that for us. We're going to be talking in a lot of ways really about the Enlightenment, which is perhaps a kind of somewhat of a misnomer in that it sort of implies an event or a single thing, but and we'll, you know, Susan is much better placed than I am to talk about what it is or what do we mean by it. But I mean, in some simple respects, I think, you know, we're talking about something that happened in the 18th century, which is a revolution, not necessarily in what to think, but in how to think, and you know, a very simple marker of it is, right, that at the beginning of the 18th century, huge numbers of highly educated, very intelligent people believe that there are witches, and don't just believe that there are witches, but believe that you must torture them and kill them and burn them. And at the end of the 18th century, actually very few intelligent people believe that. I mean, there's still all sorts of superstition and folk belief out there and all sorts of bad actors, but it would not be a respectable belief to hold. right, in educated circles. And if you just take that, something really fundamental happens, right? Because it's about how you think about the world and how you think about people and how you think about evidence and for me, like in a way, the very obvious, but the big thing that happens in that period is that as thinkers start to try to imagine from scratch, right, what does it mean to be human? They come up with a very uncomfortable answer, which is still very uncomfortable and challenging. And it's a kind of a tautology, which is to be human means to be human. It means to be a member of a species. Right? It means that humanity itself is what gives us all of these qualities. Right? And it sounds like a very nice kind of conclusion, but it's a very disturbing conclusion because it means that people who are not like me, who are not male, who are not European, who are not, good Christians, which is the way people had thought for very, very long periods of time, right? Which is that, that the idea that in order to have rights, in order to be a respectable person, you have to have certain kinds of qualities, and it's not really about being human; it's about being like us. And this process really that starts in the 18th century is kind of saying, well, actually, it's about humanity. And this is a very, very challenging idea, and it remains a very challenging idea, I think. And it's one that, Susan calls universalism, which is that fundamental idea that actually we face the challenge of having to recognize the common humanity of other people and what flows from that, right? Which is that it's not just recognizing it, but honoring it in everything we do. And I think Susan's book is a wonderful kind of reminder of what that means and how this has been challenged in recent times so much, and in a way why we need to get back to it. So I thought, Susan, maybe a good place to start, although obviously we don't want to spend our time talking about the terrible situation in Israel and Gaza, but you, in the new edition of the book, you did specifically sort of locate yourself a little bit in October 7th. Obviously as someone of Jewish heritage, trying to deal with all of that. And I thought maybe you might just like to read a little bit of that from the introduction.
Happy to, but let me start, first of all, by thanking you for that introduction and even more for the review, and therefore Katrina for the invitation. I have to tell you, I had been following your work for quite a long time, and when the publicist, my publisher, said, well, the New York Review has asked for review copies. And I said, do you have any idea who? I said, well, they wanted it sent to an address in Dublin. And I said, is it because it might, dream come true, frankly, admiring all of your work, although I haven't read all of it. It's more, you're one of these people who writes faster than I can read, but especially following your pieces in the New York Review, that was a dream come true for me. So let me read, this is the second edition, so let me, and the second edition, I thought this was rather silly, and I think I told you when we met at the Vienna Humanities Festival that people in Germany were complaining that I didn't define woke. And my point was trying to define what left is, not what woke is. And you said, well, I thought you defined it very well, briefly, but people wanted examples. And so I added about a page of examples, which I would have thought everyone was bored by. Like the German publisher who promoted a new book with the slogan, "This book will open your eyes," and then got hit by people saying this was offensive to blind people. And she and I could tell a few more stories like that, but Fintan asked me to read this. However, as I write, the latest examples of woke behavior leave nothing to laugh about. For the post-colonial woke, Israel has long been located in the global north, while Palestine belongs to the global south. The folly of this bad faith geography was revealed when many of the woke celebrated Hamas's brutal massacre of over 1,200 Israeli citizens as resistance to the occupation, or even, quote, poetic justice. Justice it was not. Many of the alleged occupiers had spent years working toward peace in ways that were direct and useful, such as bringing their Gazan neighbors to medical care. Others were 3 months old. But neither righteousness nor innocence made any difference. The victims belonged to the wrong tribe, and that was enough to murder them. Need I add that bombing thousands of children who belong to the other tribe is no less a war crime? In my book, Evil in Modern Thought, I argued that dividing evils into greater and lesser and trying to weigh them is not only hopeless, but probably obscene. Evils should not be quantified, but they can be distinguished. After corresponding with one of the pilots involved in the bombing of Hiroshima, the German Jewish philosopher Gunther Anders made an important distinction. Anyone capable of leading a child to a gas chamber or burning her alive has an abyss where there ought to be a soul. Most of us couldn't do it. But it's easier to drop a bomb on a child you never see. Precisely for that reason, this kind of evil, Anders argued, is more dangerous. But what on earth prevents us from denouncing both? I've long been a loud critic of Israel's occupation of Palestine, not to mention its increasingly far-right government, and have taken considerable flack in Germany for those views. But my criticism of the occupation has always been rooted in universalism, not tribalism, in a concern for justice, not power, and in the faith that it's possible to make progress when people work for it together. Those commitments did not save the kibbutzniks on the Gaza border, but that doesn't make them wrong. Lamentably, many who criticize the widespread celebrations of Hamas's terror and the acts of anti-Semitism that accompanied it call them failures of the international left. That's a grave mistake. Rather, it was a moment that showed how deeply woke post-colonialism has abandoned every left or liberal principle that we need to keep us straight.
So you can see how bracing the book is, and thank you for that passage, because it raises really, I mean, some of the things that we want to talk about, right? Which is the sort of fundamental idea that the imperative is for a certain kind of moral consistency, right? So that you know, human rights don't really exist at all if they're not universal, right? You know, once you start saying, well, yeah, you know, you have human rights, but you don't because I don't like you, or because, you know, you're the child of the wrong tribe, then they're not human rights, right? They're privileges that are bestowed by power on certain people and taken away from other people. So this takes us back in a way to, I mean, one of your great areas of scholarship, which is the Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment, and Susan's written brilliantly about, and we're marking the 300th anniversary of the birth of Immanuel Kant, probably maybe arguably the greatest figure of the Enlightenment. Yeah. You know, how would you define? I mean, it's a very difficult question because it's a multifaceted phenomenon. But how would you define the Enlightenment in essence, and why does it remain a key reference point for us now?
Well, perhaps the main reason is exactly the one that you said, yeah, that we have come to take for granted that there is such a thing as human rights. Yeah. But that's brand new. It was brand new, you know. I mean, you can say that both Christianity and in some forms Judaism and Islam had pieces of it, but they were articles of faith, not of reason, okay? So the very idea that you can perform an abstraction from all of the ways in which we appear to each other and say, you know, this person has a sort of dignity that should not be violated. And it's a normative term. So there are lots of people from the old counter-Enlightenment thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, who famously wrote, well, I've seen Frenchmen and Italians and Russians, and I even know, thanks to Montesquieu, that there can be such a thing as a Persian, but I've never seen man. And interestingly enough, Foucault, who goes in for some heavy beating in this book, because even if you haven't read Foucault, you read newspapers written by people who, if they read one piece of philosophy in college and weren't philosophy students, it was probably Discipline and Punishment was certainly something by Foucault, okay? And Foucault wrote that the human is an invention of the 18th century, and it will soon disappear like things written in the sand, and the waves will come and wipe it away. Now, you can say, oh yeah, Foucault was right, and you can talk about post-humanism, and we're all going to be taken over by AI anyway. But you can also say, wow, that was an achievement, okay? Because human is not something that you pick out empirically the way that you can tell if somebody's, actually, let me stop there. There's actually less and less that we can pick out about where people are from, or even perhaps what gender they are these days. But it's something that involves thought, okay? Yeah. And it was revolutionary in ways that I'm glad you read the marvelous novel Till. Yeah. I urge everyone to read the world best-selling novel Tyll by my friend Daniel Kahneman, because it describes what the world was like before the Enlightenment, and it's the best argument for the Enlightenment that I ever read. And it's also a fun, beautifully written novel. So the first thing is the ability to recognize in all of the tribal varieties that we exist in, that there's something universal that we ought to value. The second thing that the Enlightenment did was to create a concept of right that wasn't might. And if you think about the way things were in this feudal period, well, if you were a peasant and you stole the lord's deer, you could be hung for it. And there are all these beautiful, sad ballads about that. If, however, the Lord wanted the peasant's daughter for a night or however long, that was just the way things were. Yeah. So the very idea that there is a sense of justice that goes above and beyond questions of power is an Enlightenment idea. Of course, I'm faltering on that sentence because, as you mentioned last night in talking about the Supreme Court decision of the United States, they just abrogated that. I mean, they just abrogated the idea that justice ought to be separate from power. We know it often isn't, but it's a principle that until a couple of weeks ago, most of us I would even say in not in democracies, it's still a principle that the Enlightenment gave us, okay? Yeah. And the third principle that I think is really important from the Enlightenment is the idea of progress. And once again, people often caricature that as saying, oh, the world is going to keep getting better and better, and then came Auschwitz and Hiroshima, and so the Enlightenment's wrong. That's the kind of thing that you hear. But once again, think about what the sense of time was before the Enlightenment, okay? Either we fell from grace in the Garden of Eden, kept getting worse, and maybe, just maybe, if we have the right sort of faith, things will get better, but not till we die. Or some kind of notion of cyclical time that the Greeks seem to have, it just everything happens all over again. But the idea that human beings working together could make improvements in their own and other people's lives, that was a new idea, Yeah. And again, I feel like most of the criticisms or just the contempt for the blowing off of the Enlightenment results from the fact that we've so internalized some of the basic principles that we actually don't appreciate them anymore.
Yeah, yeah. And what would be really useful, I think, is to try to think about why. I suppose one of the reasons why you've got this sort of backlash against the Enlightenment, or whatever we want to call it, I mean, is so there's a sort of very reasonable way of objecting, right? Which is to say, yes, all of these ideas are great ideas, but they're all produced by white men in Europe. So they're Eurocentric. They're part of the patriarchy. They're tied up with, of course, this is also the period of the huge expansion of colonialism and all of its crimes. So why does the Enlightenment and its thinkers withstand the criticism that they are who they are?
Well, first of all, it's very much not true. And in fact, that very criticism that Europeans should look towards other parts of the world and use other parts of the world to look at themselves, that came from the heart of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
It was a trope, starting with Montesquieu's The Persians, that often Europeans who wanted to criticize European mores or European customs or European governments could not do so in their own name. So they wrote in the names as well, there were these visiting Persians, or there was this Algonquin or there were these Tahitians who, so great, I agree. We should look beyond white Europeans, and they did. I mean, one also has to think about, this is not an age of Ryanair or even train travel. So the reports they got, but there were lots. I mean, that was Kant's favorite thing to do, by the way, for, when he was taking a break, was reading travel diaries and travel journals. Okay,
Yeah.
so they were also savvy about what they didn't know. Okay, and I've started collecting people from the so-called global South. We're going to have a whole conference of them at the end of August, who actually love the Enlightenment, do not think it's Eurocentric or European, and who talk about pieces of the Enlightenment in Ghanaian culture or Bengali culture or Brazilian culture.
Yeah.
So it just happens to be false. And what ought to have been done would be to say, okay, let's expand the canon. Let's look and see actually what Ghanaian or Nigerian or Bengali thinkers are saying and writing, and let's incorporate them into this stuff. It wasn't done. I hope I'm still audible? Okay. It wasn't done, again, out of, I think, this sense of mistaken tribalism, out of a confusion of anti-colonialism with post-colonial theory, and they are not the same things at all.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, it's very striking if you think about, just to be very parochial about it for a moment, but if you think about Irish literature, for example, and I mean, Irish literature in English, I mean, it was the first real great work, you could say, of Irish writing done here, is Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and it's an overwhelmingly an Enlightenment work, it's and what does it do? It problematizes, so it gives you this comic figure of Gulliver, who is an English sea captain, right, an absolute sort of epitome of colonialism and global trade, all that sort of stuff, and then puts them into societies that work completely differently. So he's a giant in one, he's a tiny little fellow in another. And finding that, as you were saying, that these other figures are allowed to critique European society.
Absolutely.
And to say the most outrageous things about the stupidities of monarchy, the workings of aristocracy, You know, there's a wonderful scene in Gulliver's Travels where Gulliver's a kind of conservative, right? And he adores the aristocrats, you know. And he goes to this island where there are these magicians who can show you the ancestry of the past, you know. And of course, he wants to see, he has all these kind of aristocrats that he loves, and he wants to see their ancestors. And it's the tailor, it's the fiddler, you know, it's the the guy who was sleeping with their, you know, their granny or whatever, you know. And it just destroys the whole thing of heredity. I mean, all of those kinds of ideas are just kind of thrown into this washing machine and turned on their heads and spun around. And that's very Enlightenment, isn't it? I mean, that's what they're doing all the time. They're sort of taking these assumptions and twisting them inside out and satirizing them and showing how nonsensical so many of them are.
Absolutely. And, you know, again, that's also something, the idea of, you know, hereditary aristocracy that we think we've gotten rid of. Of course, there are other kinds of hereditary privilege that we live with. Yeah. But again, we don't appreciate it. What I must say, however, I must acknowledge for all that German review of the book was titled Fangirl of the Enlightenment, which that's okay. I'm fine with that. But I have to say, they didn't get sexism, with a couple of exceptions. Yeah. Condorcet, Olympe de Gouges, but by and large, the human rights that they were perfectly prepared to extend, you know, not only to people in other parts of the earth, but also, you know, made up islanders, they didn't extend to women. And I've thought a lot about why, okay? And the best answer that I can come up with, it doesn't entirely let them off the hook, but it makes it somewhat understandable that you think, wait, these people are talking about, you know, the rights of, you know, people in China or Mexico who they've never seen. But the woman living next to them, sharing their bed, you know, is somehow not the same kind of creature. And I think it has to do, oddly enough, with birth control and conditions of pregnancy through the 18th century. I mean, Voltaire's lover died in childbirth, very common thing to happen. A woman had to have 5 live births in her lifetime in order to perpetuate the species, so that it really was, unless you became a nun, I mean, which was indeed an option for some women to have a degree of autonomy, it really was such a different condition of life that it was hard to imagine women having the same kinds of rights and obligations. It doesn't let them off the hook entirely, but I think it goes some way towards explaining it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that they didn't get, but how could they have, was capitalism.
Yeah.
Okay? You know, they were living at the very beginning of the end of feudal economies. And so they didn't write about the, you know, the dangers of capitalism. But in East Germany and other places in the former countries of state socialism, Marx was considered an Enlightenment figure in line with Kant. So
yeah. One of the things that I think becomes very important, you know, in terms of how all this plays out, is this the sort of ways in which oppressed groups, for a very long time, the Haitian revolutionaries, for example, or the Irish revolutionaries, or, you know, they don't claim we should be free because we are Haitian. We should be free because we're Irish. We should be free because we're, you know, we're Ghanaian. Or whatever. They claim we should be free because we're human beings.
Yeah.
Right. So, for a long time, the language of resistance to power is a language of saying, yes, human rights are universal, and I'm a human being, and therefore I have exactly the same rights that you claim for yourself. And I always remember the most moving images still, I think, are just so touching, you know, where when Martin Luther King was murdered, he was in Memphis to support the garbage workers. You know, the garbage workers were the lowest of the low, you know. I mean, they did the most horrible jobs. They were treated abysmally, and they were on strike. And if you see the photographs of them on strike, they're not saying, we want more money, which they do want more money, of course. They want better conditions. They want to be treated better. But what their placards say is, I am a man. Just, I am a man. You know, and they were all men. You know, so they're saying, but they're basically saying, they don't mean it even in the sexist way. They mean,
No.
I'm a human being.
I'm a human being.
You know, I want to be recognized as a human being. So what happens, like, so for centuries, really, that's the claim that oppressed groups make, right? Which is that I wish to be recognized in this universal way as having the same human rights as everybody else. Why does that begin to not work anymore? How do we move towards saying, no, but I'm a member of a group, I'm a member of a tribe, that's why I should get what I want?
You know, I was hoping you could give me the answer to that, because it's actually the subject of my next book, which is partly written. No, let me describe it a little more, because I mention it a bit in this book, but I don't go into it in detail. A very funny thing happened in the middle of the 20th century. For as long as people have been writing human history, the hero has been the subject of history.
Yeah.
And they're all different kinds of heroes, and Carlyle, you know, typified them. And it wasn't just military heroes, literary heroes, but people competed with each other to be a hero, okay? And, you know, I have read quite a bit about Irish revolutions and, you know, learned certain stirring songs and, you know, the Haitian Revolution, everything else. My thesis, but I'm not sure why it happened, is that two things happened in the middle of the 20th century. One was the Holocaust, and one was the anti-colonial movements. And between those, the sense that victims had been written out of history, because history was written by the victors, the sense that attention should turn to the victims of history and not to the heroes. And besides, people were so sick of the blood, and 60 million people killed in World War II, which also heralded the beginning of the end of colonialism. And so it was a correction in the right direction, but like many corrections, it got overcorrected. And so, you know, we have, as we all now know ad nauseum, people like Donald Trump see that victimhood is the coin with which to gain sympathy, appeal, authority, okay? And of course, I'm not against paying attention to genuine victims, but the idea that being a victim is a sense of authority, I believe started there, and it's been kind of, you know, washing through the entire world, you know, in the last 70 years or so.
Yeah.
And it's a perilous way of looking at the world, because it means that authority or legitimacy no longer comes from what you do in the world, but what the world did to you, okay? What the world did to me was, and I said I'd hope you might help me think about this, because the book isn't done. I mean, it's a lot of it's done, but I'm still trying to figure out how that functions, where you have, you know, perfectly wonderful examples of heroism, you know, up through sort of, you know, the mid to the, you know, Paul Robeson's one of my heroes. We're doing a whole conference on Paul Robeson, you know, who could have, I suppose, taken a stance of a victim and didn't, never would have dreamed of it, actually. And I think that's the kind of thing that indeed gave him this genuinely heroic quality. Why people suddenly decided, I mean, I think because it's hard, actually. It's easier to, you know, have your identity be about what the world did to you than to be active in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I suppose, once you start thinking about identity, and it's critical, we all have multiple identities. And maybe we have more and more identities as the 20th century goes into the 21st. And therefore, identity actually gets harder in a way because, I mean, identity, we all know in our lives, we have 3 different identities in one day, depending on who you're talking to,
Only
what
3?
the context is, at least, and but when you start politicizing identity in that sense, it's very difficult to pin down, and it's almost always invented, because you pick one thing and you say that's our identity, and what happens then, I think, is that it becomes much easier to say what you're not. So actually saying who you really are is very difficult because it's complex and contradictory, and it's shifting all the time. And we sort of know about this very well in Ireland, which is that, I mean, the Troubles are a really terrible example of it, where it actually becomes a lot easier to say, well, we're not them, and therefore we feel an enormous sense of our own power, our own belonging, simply by being not them. And getting out of that becomes really difficult, right? So once you're in that cycle, it's very, very hard to break.
Well, especially because, so I don't use the word identity politics ever, because I think it begs the question it's meant to solve.
Yeah.
The idea that our identities are essentially determined along these 2 axes, okay, ethnic background and gender. And it's not an accident, okay? Those are the 2 axes on which one might say, so first of all, you don't choose them.
Yeah.
We have no agency in choosing them. Gender, let's say biological sex, you can choose your gender, but your biological sex and your ethnic identity are things that you're born and stuck with, okay? And you can get new passports and change, but you're still, I have lived the better part of my life outside the US, but I still get identified as an American, and that's okay, in some sense. I think the country you're most ashamed of is the country that has your heart in some sense.
Yes.
So, but, if you think about introducing yourself to someone or filling out a dating profile, which so many people do these days, the idea of saying, well, I'm a white woman, was just ridiculous. I mean, this is, and we all know that, okay? So it's taking, identity politics takes these 2 features of us that are the most passive and the most vulnerable and essentializes them into, this is my identity. And I want to say, well, no, it's not. I am Jewish. What people often don't know, unfortunately, in this day and age, is that there is a great Jewish universalist tradition that starts with the Bible, and it starts with the experience of slavery in Egypt, and says 33 times, I asked my rabbi about this for a piece I was writing, 33 times, you should take care of the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt. And, all of the actual famous Jews, from Moses Mendelssohn to Albert Einstein, were all universalist Jews, not nationalists. There's a nationalist line, but it's only 3 times. But the fact that I'm a universalist Jew had something to do with my upbringing in a family in Atlanta, Georgia, where my mother was involved in the civil rights movement, precisely, and actually our synagogue was precisely because, we were slaves in Egypt, and our place is with people who were slaves in Georgia. And that fact is so much more important to my own identity than the fact that I share some genes with Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
I mean, give me a break,
I want to let the audience in, but I just want to ask you about one last thing, which seems to be kind of critical, and you've mentioned it already, but you said one of the things that comes from the Enlightenment is this idea of progress. And of course, that idea of progress reaches a sort of abysmal conclusion in a way with the Holocaust, right? So where, you know, people are very reasonably looking at it and saying, well, is this what we've produced? You know, well then maybe this whole idea of progress is just a lie. And, you know, we look around us now and we see we're back into, you know, land war in Europe, you know, some of which seems like the First World War. You know, the Middle East is, you know, seems to be caught in this kind of sort of cycles of violence. So there are good reasons for people to be skeptical about progress. But it also seems to me that if we don't recapture the idea of progress, what you get is Trump. You know, so the left has to have an idea that it is possible for things to get better for, you know, the vast bulk of people. And I mean, the reason you've got Trump, for example, so potent in America is that so many people have lost faith, not in a sort of abstract idea of progress, but just thinking my kids' lives are going to be better than my life. Or if you're a young person, well, you know, that you think, well, my life is better than my parents' life. That's progress, and it's not happening for so many people. So how do we recapture an idea of progress without giving way to a sort of stupid optimism?
So I don't think it's that hard. If you remember that, you know, the sort of quick argument you were making, well, we thought that was progress and then came Auschwitz, depends actually on a Hegelian or a Marxist idea of progress, that it's automatic, that the world is, you know, and which basically goes back to an old idea of providence, right? That, you know, it's going to keep moving us forward and, you know, we don't have to do anything about it. And the Enlightenment did not think that at all. I mean, they were some of the bleakest literature that I've ever read was written in the Enlightenment. I mean, I can, you know, quote you some passages of Kant. They were quite savvy about the evils that they saw, including slavery and colonialism, which they, most of them protested against violently. But people then say, well, they were living in the age of slavery and colonialism, and it, you know, human rights didn't stop it. And so, well, I didn't stop the war in Iraq either, okay? Yeah. I mean, the Enlightenment thinkers were left-wing intellectuals who tried really hard with the tools that left-wing intellectuals have, writing, talking, trying to persuade. And, you know, famously, we don't win all of our battles, okay? But to think that, you know, somehow it did no good, you know, one has to accept the possibility of failure, but then realize, no, progress is not automatic. It completely depends on us. And it also depends on thinking carefully. I mean, yes, they didn't realize all of the perils of technology, but they weren't talking about technological progress. They were talking about moral progress, progress in a sense of liberty, you know, both personal, I mean, that someone was not condemned to do whatever their parents and grandparents had done before them. I mean, for example, that's a new idea, right? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I don't know if you want me to stop there.
No, I think that's a very good place to bring in the audience. Can we bring the lights up? And I
mean, you're actually a wonderful example of a product of the Enlightenment in many ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have enlightenment, yeah. You know, just, I mean, I think well, that's why we're here, isn't it? I mean, everybody's here, you know, that we still, there is a fundamental faith in the possibility of talking, you know, in a rational, humane way about who we are and where we're going. And if we give up on that, then it's not that stuff stops. It's that other stuff happens, you know, and we see it. That's really what's going on around us. Has anybody? Yes, please. Thank you very much. Could you just hang on a second for the mic? Thank you.
The idea of being many of the people who propound woke or identity politics ideas often have the idea that it is in some way dangerous, anti-establishment. And they're often as well identified or as left or Marxist. The problem is, though, that you find, for example, in the United States now, that a huge range of companies, many of whom which are very, very hostile to unions and so on, actually insist on having these ideas as part of their own philosophy.
Yeah.
And new people, for example, joining those companies have to attend meetings and essentially give their agreement to these policies. Now, if, however, another aspect of left or Marxist ideas was added to that, for example, the inalienable right to form a trade union, I don't think these companies would be too keen on it.
No.
So, to a large extent, really left and woke ideas are, in many respects, it's baffling to me how they're regarded as, how woke can be regarded as left at all.
Well,
Yeah,
sorry.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, and I think an essential idea, if you're a left, an essential aspect of that has got to be, whether you're on the revolutionary left or, say, the social democratic left, which is about reforms, like people like, say, Jeremy Corbyn, La France Insoumise and so on, we're really social democrats. At the same time, they begin from a basis that society is, there's a class division in society. And that is the basis of the struggle. It's a struggle over the surplus, it's a struggle over the wealth. But
Yeah, so I see it a little bit differently. I'm as unimpressed by class reductionism as I am by, race or sex reductionism. Where I think socialism is absolutely right is in the claim that social rights are human rights. That is, right to fair labor practice, medical care, housing, access to culture. All of those things are codified in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, okay? And, those are things that everyone should have, whatever class they were born into. Now, look, calling the woke Marxists is, first of all, it's a Trumpy or kind of trick. I mean, it's ridiculous. They're not. Where I think the confusion comes in is that woke is powered by a lot of left-wing emotions. That is, when in doubt, stand on the side of the underdog, try to help the marginalized, try to right the wrongs of history, or at least, those are all emotions that are genuine left-wing emotions. And what I argue in the book is that most of the woke don't realize that they're actually being powered, along with these genuine left-wing emotions, by a lot of very reactionary ideas. And so, of course, it's easier for corporations to put a couple of people of color and a couple of women on their boards than it is to actually change the working structure. No question about it. And I wish it were only an American problem. But to my surprise, I was also rather pleased. This book is already out, or is out, in 12 languages. And I had a very interesting time in Spain and Chile and Brazil, all of which have socialist governments, okay? But all of which have a huge woke problem. The Chilean young new president, who was celebrated as the rebirth of Allende and is a socialist, wanted to rewrite the Constitution that had not been changed since Pinochet, and couldn't do it because there were too many woke demands that people objected to. I mean, honestly, I could not believe that I would be in Santiago or in Sao Paulo and people were talking about bathrooms, but they were, I mean, you would think this should not be a political issue anywhere, even in North Carolina. I mean, normally people close the door when they go to the bathroom, and that's that, But that this turned into a political question that not only derailed people in North Carolina, but also in Santiago and Sao Paulo. It's a problem, I think, for reasons that you suggested. It's way easier to go tribal than it is to go universalist and think about a genuine socialism. You said something about revolution. Somebody attacked me in Germany, of course. Said, oh, well, she's not really a leftist, she's just a social democrat. And I mean, if there's anybody around who, in this day and age with the nuclear clock 3 minutes to midnight, who's actually arguing for violent revolution, I guess I think they ought to be locked up.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks very much. And then the gentleman here. So just in the middle here, sorry. Sorry, we have to get the mic so people can hear you. Could we just get the mic there? Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks, both of you. I just wanted to raise the issue that somehow the left in Ireland and Western Europe, possibly even the United States, seem to have got split during the recent pandemic, because one section of the left would have followed a basic distrust of big pharma, and would have followed also alternative medical practices than those that are available through state or private medicine. And therefore, you know, when it came down to the vaccination mandates and the feeling that certain people wish to express their liberty of choice over the autonomy of their own bodies and the medical systems they practiced, it was very hard to find any voice in the public media or on a public platform to stand up for such like. And I know as one of the 10% minority, as we were called at the time, it was quite scary to be so victimized, as it were. And I think afterwards there was a feeling that the left has splintered. And I heard people saying no longer can we call ourselves true left.
Thanks very much. Can we maybe just take so there's one here and one here. And if we might get a female question, it would be also very welcome. We're not to be too woke about it either, but just thank you.
Thank you both for the talk. I'm just wondering, there's some sections of leftist thinking that would suggest that since the 1970s, the 1980s, what people like David Harvey would call, you know, the neoliberalization of a lot of the West, that perhaps the advancement of late capitalism has been such that sections of particularly the young left have had to turn towards identity politics because of the raw power of capitalist mechanics across the West. I'm just wondering where that comes into your philosophy, and how do we have a marriage of the two?
Great question, thank you.
Very good question. I try and talk a little bit about this in the end of the book. Look, I think the really important date is 1991. And it didn't have to go the way that it did. And I think it's important to remember that 1991, I'm talking about the collapse of state socialism, there were lots of avenues open. People were talking about a peace dividend, that you could have honestly solved every single material problem in the world on the money that is spent on military. People were talking about non-alignment. You know, there was an extreme hope, and together, the politicians, the finance people, and popular culture collaborated in making us feel that global neoliberalism is the end of history, and there's nothing else we can do. There are lots of forms of capitalism, there could be lots of forms of socialism, but the message that kept going was, it all ends in the gulag, been there, done that, we're not going to try anything else. And I think you're absolutely right that the sense of hopelessness, of genuinely changing a system for a global project of justice for everyone, died thanks to this message, it didn't, I mean, honestly, it doesn't all have to lead to the gulag. There are lots of other alternatives. And so I agree with you that people who, wanted to engage in something progressive, standing beside the underdog seemed like the only way to go, because there was no longer a more universalist project that looked at all viable. But we need to revive that project, or we're all sunk, if only because global neoliberalism will sink the planet.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the word growth, because people do not ever question the metaphor. The metric on which you judge whether a country is functioning is they had X% growth. And I've thought sometimes of, just making a big poster that says growth and showing all the dumping grounds in the third world where our plastics go to live when they expire after the warranty is over, that kind of thing is so, it's just so deep. Growth is a positive metaphor, but what it's actually saying is killing us.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to take the woman here and there's a gentleman here. I'll just take the two together and then put it back to Susan. So thank you very much. And then, we're over time, I'm afraid, but thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for the very stimulating conversation. My question really is around maybe a concern that I have that the anti-woke sort of message maybe doesn't take into account the fact that people have to identify their identity in order to identify the injustice that they have suffered. And there's systematic injustices against people because of their identity, whether it's gender or the colour or whatever. So is there an extent to which you are not going to be able to properly fight for justice if you don't identify your identity, I suppose is the question.
Do you want to take
we'll just
together?
so there's just a man at the front here, and that's going to be, I'm really sorry about the time, but we're just going to take this and
I
then
can stand outside, and if anybody wants to answer the question, I don't have an immediate other appointment, so.
Thank you.
So this relates to the previous comment, but to what extent is it helpful or misleading to think of universalism as post-tribalism or post-identificationism?
To what extent is it helpful? I mean, see, first of all, to the person asking the first question, I reject the idea that my identity is, is determined as, well, first of all, there's a question about whether Jews are white, right? So, I mean, is my identity white, Jew, woman? No, actually. I mean, because if I were playing that game, okay, I would have to, say, well, actually, the Palestinians are the ones who need to be defended against, okay? That is, before I can take a step to care about anybody else's injustice but my own, I have to be a universalist. As Fintan was saying with the demonstration of the sanitation workers in Memphis, I am a man, I am a human. And I don't see any other way that we can ever create a society that is not based on, as frankly the current debates over Israel and Gaza, my pain is worse. No, my pain is worse. No, we suffered more. No, we did. There's no way that we can ever come to any, sense of common justice until we stop doing that. And, I'll say this once again, go back to where we started. If you want to see a society where tribalism based on identity politics, furthered by an appeal to past grievous suffering. Look at what Netanyahu does with the Holocaust.
And look across the border. I mean, we live this stuff. So, but I mean, the point you're making, I think, is a critical one, and I don't think there's a contradiction, really, which is that, of course, everybody has to start from where they are and who they are. And of course, people experience injustices because they're women, because they're black, because they're Jewish, or they're Palestinian. You know, and of course, that's the way the world is. But I think there's a critical difference then between saying, I demand to be, you know, to have justice because of who I am. You know,
Right.
So I mean, I think historically, people who have successfully resisted injustice and have done so by obviously starting with, if you like, a sense of identity, right, in that very broad sense, right? But that's not where they end, right? So the next immediate step is to say, you know, I have the right to be treated with dignity as a human being, you know, and it goes back for me that you know, great claim by Immanuel Kant, you know, who says our moral obligation is to treat every single individual as an end in themselves rather than as a means to an end. Right? And that's a universalist, you know, it's actually saying that to recognize our own humanity, we have to recognize it in other people, and we have to then act on it, which is that we treat every other person as having the same autonomy and dignity that I demand for myself. So you know, we can get kind of lost in a sort of contradiction where it seems, well, you know, of course people, you know, the feminist movements, for example, demanding the vote. They're demanding the vote because they're women, because they're denied the vote, of course, absolutely. But then they're not saying, you know, I should have a vote because I'm a woman. They're saying I should have a vote because I'm a human being, and I have exactly the same rights as a man has and should have. You know, so it's really where you go with it, I think, is the critical issue.
Well, if I can just disagree with you briefly with...
Let's do another hour.
No. I mean, I think you're fundamentally right, but a case occurred to me of someone, again, my hero, Paul Robeson, whose father was born into slavery, who suffered just the most awful racism his whole life. But guess what? He became an actor. He became an extremely well-known actor. He was not involved in the civil rights movement initially. Do you know what got him involved? It was a group of striking Welsh miners singing on the street in London. Yeah. Okay? And then he went on to, one of the many things that he did was sort of create a canon of universal leftist songs. He said he could argue in 9 languages and sing in 26.
And I think that might well be true of Susan as well. What a pleasure it's been to be in your company. And thank you so much.